For you guys that have seen videos on my channel before, you know that when I reference a photograph for a painting, I prefer to use the grid method, so that's what I'm doing here. I'm just lining up with a ruler, putting some little ticks on the canvas for where I'm going to place my grid, and reference my photograph with the grid I already put on the photo to the canvas. Here I'm starting to sketch out the scene using thinned down oil paint. So I'm using oil paint for this full painting here. I am thinning it down using citrus solvents. If you would like to grab some for yourself, that's in the description below. I started just roughly sketching the horizon line where the sea meets the sky, and then I started to add some outlines for the clouds, and finally an outline for the starfish. One important thing to note while you're sketching out the starfish is that because the starfish is under the water, we have some refraction of light, so the starfish doesn't have a perfectly symmetrical straight limbs coming out of its center. I'm showing you hand motions right now, but you can't see me. That's why I'm laughing at myself. But things are a little distorted, so that's why I sketched that out a little wavy, and some of the limbs aren't quite as long as the others. So the starfish is going to look realistic once we get some actual paint in there, but for now it looks a little off. After I got the painting sketched out, next I started to work on the sky. And I'm just taking my palette knife here. I blended phthalo blue, phthalo green, and titanium white on the palette there with my palette knife, and I just started to place some in the sky, and I added more phthalo blue to darken and make it more of a cool saturated blue to the palette there, and then I started to add some of those up above the phthalo blue, phthalo green, and white combo just to darken the sky as it's getting higher up, closer to outer space. Once I had a decent amount of coverage of oil paint from using my palette knife to get it onto the canvas, I took my large flat-tipped brush and just went back and forth and did lots and lots of blending. I started at the base where we have the lightest color and then worked my way up, and then started to work my way back down and work my way up and then work my way back down until I had a nice even transition from that light green blue color into the more blue, cool saturated blue color at the top of the canvas. So that's a very important part of the sky, is to have a nice smooth transition. Here I'm taking some white paint and I'm just blending that right in with that color that's already on the canvas just to brighten things up a little bit. If you are recreating this piece with acrylic paint, then you want to do this sooner rather than later. If you're doing this with oil paint, then you have hours and hours because the paint you just put down is still very wet. Acrylic paint is going to dry much faster, so you want to work a little bit more quickly if you want to brighten something up by adding some white. Alright, now we have that base background color of the sky. I'm going to leave the clouds for now empty, and then we're going to start working on that horizon line where the sky meets the sea. So this color is a blend of phthalo blue, Prussian blue, phthalo green, white, and maybe a hint of brown or black. So you don't need to use all those colors, but by using those colors you're muting that blue down a little bit because it's so far in the distance and it is deep water. It is that darker blue, but it's more faded. It is more muted. It's not super saturated because it's so far into the distance. So that's why adding that brown, black, or white can help mute your colors down that are really far away. I'm getting right up in front of the camera here because to get that nice straight horizon line I have to hold the brush at a very flat angle, very slowly go back and forth, just get it right in front of me so I can get a nice straight horizon line. So make sure you have a nice solid straight horizon line. You're welcome to use tape or a ruler. I don't usually use those unless I'm painting buildings or something, but you are very welcome to do that if you so choose. Now we're starting to move into the more shallow section of the water, and we're getting more greens and purples and yellows in our water because we're starting to get some of the color from the sand below the water because the water's so clear here. So this section still has lots of green in it, so we have our phthalo green mixed with white and a tiny dab of phthalo blue still. And then as I'm moving forward, I'm blending on my palette, adding little tiny bits more of titanium white, starting to add little hints of ultramarine blue just to cool that down a bit, starting to add hints of yellow ochre, and starting to add hints of flesh tint. So these are colors that you'll find in the sand, and I'm just bringing more and more of those colors in as I'm moving closer to the foreground because the sand is starting to become the predominant color, and we're having some highlights and shadows with the light bringing itself down through the water and hitting the sand too. But for now I'm just working on a base color in general. Then we'll go back with detail and we'll start to add some shadows from the ripples of the water and from the sand. And now we blend. I'm still using that large flat-tipped brush. I'm being very cautious at the top there, close to the horizon line, making sure I don't get into the sky at all. And then I'm going a little bit more loosely, making back and forth and crisscross brush strokes throughout the water part of this painting, so like definitely the bottom third of this painting. And I'm just blending in all those colors that I already put down with the palette knife. And there's a little deeper section in the upper right you can see, so I added a little more phthalo blue to that area. And then we have more of the gray muted colors by adding our yellow ochre and our flesh tint, and I may have even added some brown, but definitely lots of white and phthalo green in this ocean here. Nice shallow tropical waters have lots of phthalo green and white during the day. And I'm still using the large brush for the starfish to get that base color in. I am blending my burnt umber, my magenta, and that's giving me a cool reddish purple. And then I have some orange, which I'm blending with my cadmium yellow medium and burnt sienna to give me the warm colors on the starfish. So this starfish has a highlight section on it and a shadowy section, and I'm playing with warm and cool colors to give me warm highlights and cool shadows, just for the base color. Now I'm adding a shadow for under the starfish. This is a blend of Prussian blue, white, and burnt umber, and it's giving me that muted blue-gray color there. And I'm just adding that on certain little side borders of the starfish, exactly where I'm seeing the shadow in my reference photograph. My next step is to start to build up where we're going to have shadows and ripples and different types of detail in the water that ends up bringing the water to looking very realistic. These subtle little shadows and building up these layers of paint between, little bits of shadow and really dramatic highlights where the light's like super reflecting off of a ripple of water. That's what makes water look so realistic. You have to really think about all these little bits of detail. When you're just looking at it, you think, okay, that's simple. It's just a starfish and some blue water and some clouds, but it's really more complicated than that. We have all different kinds of little plays with light and different ripples of light, where we have a nice little ridge of a ripple of highlight, which is pure white, but then the colors that bounce off of that highlight also have red, orange, yellow, blue, green in them. We have so many colors in the water here that you wouldn't necessarily think of just by looking at this photograph. You might not realize how many colors and bits of detail that we really have in this painting. So here I'm just starting to build up where I'm seeing some ripples, and I'm just working on adding some cooler little shadows here, and I'm keeping in mind that these shadows are getting smaller as they're getting farther into the distance. They're getting a little bit less contrast as they're going farther into the distance, and they're getting closer together as they're going farther off into the distance. Here I'm just taking some of my titanium white and putting it on the water that I painted a little bit ago, so the oil paint is still wet. Again, if you are using acrylic paint here, then you might have to re-blend a new color that's just lighter and incorporates more white into your mixture. But since my paint was still wet, I just took some white and blended that in there just to give a little bit more depth, and also to start to show the reflection of the highlights from the clouds above. So I didn't add the color into the actual clouds yet, but we do have a reflection from the highlight where the clouds are almost pure white in the sky, and I'm just adding those reflections by gently taking my brush and adding white paint and brushing it back and forth so that we're just brightening up that section just a little, just enough to give us that little subtle highlight from the clouds above. Here we have the base layer of paint going down for the clouds. For the shadowy part of the clouds, I used Prussian blue, black, and white. And for the highlighted section of the cloud as a base color, I'm adding some ultramarine blue with white. And that's not going to give me a super brightest white for a highlight on a cloud. I definitely do not want to start with pure white, and I want to start with a little bit more of a dull color, even a little bit more of a shadow, and then I'll build up my highlights later on after this layer dries. Here I'm working on the detail in the starfish. First I'm starting to boost the contrast and the saturation on the starfish just to make it pop and just really draw your attention to it. So I'm mixing cadmium red, burnt sienna, orange, and cadmium yellow medium to get that really saturated reddish brown orange color there. And then I'm adding more purple and brown and a cool red to get that shadow color, maybe even hints of black. And then I got a nice little separation there between highlight and shadow, and this starfish has a really nice little design on it. I'm not sure what it's called. If there's a term for the species of starfish, I'm not sure what species it is, but this one has like a really nice little yellow rim around the center of it, and then each arm has a little yellow line going from the center out to the tip of each arm. So it was really beautiful, detailed little starfish. So I started to paint this section by just taking cadmium yellow medium and very lightly holding my brush and letting it drag the paint out, not in a perfectly straight line, but with a little bit of rounded edges there, and just bring the line from the ring of the center out to the edge of each arm on the starfish. And I'm going to add some shadows and make certain parts of those little yellow lines more detailed, but for now that was just to let me know where each of those 5 arms, where the ridge is, and then I start to build up more detail with more of those little yellow lines and almost like a grid on the starfish, like the pattern on the starfish, after I figured out where those 5 main lines are going to be. By this point we're in my next studio session working on this piece, so the base color has completely dried, and now I'm starting to build up an additional layer of the subtle shadows and very strong highlights that we have in the water around the starfish. So I started with that cooler shadow, adding some Prussian blue. Now I'm just taking a liner brush and I went in and did some ripples where we have some highlights in the water. I'm also starting to, bounce around a bit now, and I'm adding the detail in the starfish with that cadmium yellow medium, and then I'll go back later and I'll cool down some of those highlights and make things a little bit more defined in the body of the starfish. Alright, we've made it to the point where things start to get a little crazy with the water. So this is where I start to add more highlights and more little shadows and just try to bring in all of the colors that we're starting to see being reflected in the water. So for this bright ripple color, I'm just using a little bit of yellow ochre mixed with white, and that's just giving me a little bit of an off-white color for that reflection where the light is reflecting right off of it. And I'm starting to add some colors in certain spots around the highlight where we have some colors seen in the reference photograph, where just all these little colors are bouncing off of that little light reflective spot. So you'll see me add little bands of bright red, bright orange, and then on the other side of that highlight we have cool blue, green, and purple. So we basically get the whole rainbow in a couple of these ripples. Quite a few of these ripples actually, and I just basically put them in the painting where I was seeing them in my reference photograph. And again, you can see me bouncing back to the starfish. I just kept coming back to the starfish. It helps to keep me sane to not only focus on water ripples for an 8-hour painting session. It was very helpful to go back and spend some time on the detail in the starfish, and then when I got sick of the starfish, I went back to working on the water. In my reference photograph, we also had tiny little dots in the sand from small particles of sand grains and little minerals and things like that. So I'm taking my brush and just, it's not a liner brush, but it's a fine-tipped round brush, and I'm just doing some little dabs with different colors, some as like a cool blue-gray, some brown, some more light gray, and just adding little dots of different sizes throughout the foreground there where we can start to see some of those grains in the sand under the water. Next, I went back to the clouds. Since my base layer had dried, now I can go back and start to build up the detail and start to give us that appearance of depth with the clouds. So we have this big, nice cumulus cloud there, and we have a lot of depth to it. The shadows get closer towards the bottom of the cloud as the cloud is moving farther away from us, and we have some highlights coming in there as well. So for those shadow colors, again, I'm still using a Prussian blue with black and white, and that's just giving me that like gray blue color. Then I'm starting to build up my highlights after I get the shadows in there. Earlier you saw when I was putting in my base layer of color that I added a little bit of white and blended that in to show where the highlights would be from the reflection of the clouds. Now I'm building up on top of that. So that layer of paint dried. Now I'm just taking my white and I'm almost dry brushing it in. I'm not overloading the brush with paint. I'm just putting a little bit of paint on there and taking the brush back and forth to add that nice highlight where we have the highlight from the clouds reflecting on the water. Here I am working on adding subtle details, not too bold and not the main focus, but just trying to get a little bit of differentiation between highlight and shadow, starting to give a little bit of movement in the water, building up highlights in sections that are more shallow, building up that blue in the deeper areas, adding some subtle color changes where there might be some seaweed or something under the water or a shadow from the light of the waves over the water. There are a lot of different things manipulating the colors in the water, so I'm just trying to repeat what I'm seeing in the reference photograph and pull that into the painting. That central area of the canvas where the water is not super duper shallow and it's not the focus of our painting is definitely not the most important part. What I'm working on here is more important. It's the closer part to the viewer, which, you know, closer to the foreground, and the very shallow water to the left and right of the starfish. That's where our focus is. That starfish is the main focus, so the water right around that starfish is going to be very important, and we definitely want that to look accurate so that everything reads. When you look at the piece, you're like, okay, that makes sense. You don't think, oh, something's a little bit off here. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm adding those nice full color spectrum from the rainbow into some of these water ripples where the light is hitting that ripple and it's bringing all of these colors for us. So we have reds, orange, yellows, and then that's on the closer side to us. And then on the other side of that little ripple, we have the cooler colors, the greens, blues, and purples. So it's nice that we get like a little bit of a rainbow in many of these ripples in the water. And that is another thing that really brings this painting to life, is that it's something that you would see in nature when you're looking at the water and it's reflecting back at you. And that's the basic gist of it for creating this painting. I do not call this painting complete at this point. There's a lot more detail I want to go into with really boosting that contrast on the starfish, since it's our main focus, and then also adding another highlight on top of all of those ripples and making the clouds look a little bit more smooth and realistic, because right now I think they look a little too painterly for my liking. So I am not 100% done with this painting, but for educational purposes and explaining to you how I did this process, I think I've covered that. The only thing I'm going to do is, like I said, boost the contrast, add a tiny bit more detail, and then I'll call it a finished piece. So maybe I'll give you guys a nice time lapse to show you start to finish next week, if I can get this painting completely done in time for that. But other than that, thanks for watching. If you guys have any questions or new ideas for painting videos, leave a comment below and I'd be happy to make a painting tutorial for you.